to listen again.
I think they're made
Yeah.
available on Moodle
Yeah.
already.
Uh,
Thanks to Xiaojing's help, of course. Right.
just wanna 22nd September. Not the latest one. The latest one maybe 29 September or 30th September. Yeah.
My
And
understanding is that all these class sessions have been regularly recorded and uploaded. So maybe you could check again. Mm,
uh,
right.
wow. Okay.
Sure thing.
Thank
All
you.
right.
I could do it
And
by
before we
myself.
begin, any other thoughts or questions, especially with regards to what we talked about last time? Something related to the body-based satipatthana, perhaps the optional readings you've been doing on the side. Okay. If not, we are going to proceed to talk about the second tetrad. So let me just quickly share my screen. So here, what you're looking at is a review of the so-called 16 steps. And as we have explained, these 16 steps come from the Anapanasati Sutta. The first four is traditionally classified as the so-called bodily based satipatthana, right? And the second group of four is called the feeling based, which will be the focus of our discussion today. And if you were to look at the specific steps, number five, the meditator trains herself. I will breathe in sensitive to piti, rapture, happiness, elation, joy. There are many different translations, right? He trains himself. I will breathe out sensitive to happiness, rapture, so forth. Number six, he trains himself. I'll breathe in sensitive to pleasure. He trains himself. I'll breathe out sensitive to pleasure, right? Which is sukha. Number seven, he trains himself. I will breathe in sensitive to mental fabrication. Now, you might find this term familiar, right? We've come across it when we were talking about the body based satipatthana. But in that context, instead of mental fabrication, we had body fabrication, right? Once again, this is mental sankhara, mental activities, mental concoctions, mental formations, or many different translations. He trains himself or breathe out sensitive to mental sankharas. Finally, number eight, this is the last step in the feeling based tetrad. She trains herself, I will breathe in calming, tranquilizing, pacifying mental sankhara. He trains himself, I'll breathe out. So by this point, you might have noticed some kind mental sankharas and calming mental sankharas, respectively. Okay. So uh, once again, I'm going to um, give you a little more context this particular tetrad, how the feeling-based satipatthana works. First things first, in the Buddhist time, there were a number of contemporaneous Upanishadic Shamana culture, right? So in other words, in ancient India, we've had a number of the so-called contemplative traditions. They were to varying degrees, uh, inspired by teachings found in texts such as the Upanishads, right? And therein, you will find teachings that are largely reminiscent of Buddhist teachings. For example, in the Upanishads, you will come across a saying to the effect of how suffering is caused as a result of the mind becoming attached to phenomena. Okay. So, in other words, the Buddha was not really unique in having identified craving or attachment to be the root cause of suffering. The other teachers did as well. So, exactly how was the Buddha distinguished from the other teachers? It wasn't necessarily with regards to his expositions on the Four Noble Truths, right? Because the other teachers too also talked about how um, attachment leads to suffering, which is really the gist of the Four Noble Truths. Well, the Buddha um, self-awaringly differentiated himself or set himself apart by saying that I taught or I teach middle path. So exactly what is the middle path? Most people nowadays subscribe to a more popularized, diluted version of the middle path, and they figure that the middle path is primarily about avoiding two extremes, right? One being sensory indulgence, and the other being asceticism or self-mortification. So, in other words, the spiritual practice laid down by the Buddha was about steering clear of undergoing unnecessary suffering or inflicting pain on your own body, right, with the hope of exhausting perhaps evil karma, right? And then on the other hand, sensory indulgence, right, chasing after sensory enjoyment and so forth. And if you could somehow steer clear of these two extremes, you are in the middle path. However, I want to explain to you that there is a greater significance. There is a more profound layer to the teaching of the middle path that has to do with the fact that the Buddha and a number of other teachers have all equally identified craving to be a root cause. But they taught different soteriology. They offer different solutions, right? They explain how um, craving can exactly be eradicated through very different means. Most other teachers argue that, well, craving is rooted in our exposure to pleasurable experiences. If you really think about it, what is craving? Craving is the fact that you have, in the past, come across a pleasurable experience and you feel nostalgic for it. You miss it. You want to revisit it. You want to duplicate it. You want to expand it. You are looking forward to its return, right? You are welcoming it, yearning for it, and so forth. And so the solution offered by many other teachers was that um, pleasure is just intrinsically attachment inducing, right? If you allow yourself to experience happiness and pleasure, then the likely result is that you become dependent on such an experience. The Buddha, on the other hand, argued that, well, number one, not all pleasures are created equal. There's some pleasures are conducive to addiction, to dependency, to attachment, whereas there are other kinds of pleasure that are either harmless, right? They do not lead to addiction, or that in fact would help you in attaining greater peace, greater equanimity, and greater capacity to let go. This was really the revolutionary, the radical idea presented by the Buddha. Not so much about his identifying craving as the root cause of suffering. Okay. There is more to be said about this because this message is largely lost in much of mainstream Buddhism. So, for example, if you find yourself in a typical retreat situation, let's say, you signed up for a 7-day retreat, right? 14-day retreat, 30-day retreat. And in the course of the retreat, you stumbled across pleasure. You begin to feel, this exceeding otherworldly happiness. You begin to, have this, overwhelming sense of pleasure pervading the body and so forth. And you report such phenomena to the teacher. And how are the teachers likely to respond? They're likely to tell you to ignore the happiness and retreat, right? To ignore the pleasure, right? They want to implant in you the idea that these experiences are kind of like taboos, right? If you were to somehow dwell on these experiences, they will lead to, you know, um, being distracted from your main task, and worse yet, becoming attached, becoming corrupted, right? Being misled by these experiences. So they will ask you to go back to your breath. They'll ask you to go back to bare witnessing, right? Bare observation, the pure insight practice, and so forth, right? And this attitude is not just found in Buddhism, but also in secular traditions that were inspired by Buddhism. For example, in clinical psychological settings, you have people like John Kabat-Zinn, right, who had um, integrated the Buddhist practice of mindfulness into psychotherapeutic paradigms. So you have a whole set of cognitive psychological therapies and behavioral psychological therapies that are quote unquote mindfulness based, right? You have the mindfulness based cognitive psychological therapy and so on and so forth, right? And in those contexts, how is mindfulness defined? It is typically defined as non-judgmental acceptance of the present moment, right? Non-judgmental acceptance of whatever is happening. And implicit in this is the idea that you're supposed to not interfere with what is happening. You're supposed to just accept, just surrender to what is happening. And once again, happiness and pleasure, they are um, not something you want to um, be distracted by, much less to actively cultivate them. Okay. Um, at the beginning of the semester, we talked about how this non-judgmental acceptance of the present moment is actually more akin to another Buddhist idea other than mindfulness, right? This definition accords better with the notion of equanimity. So when you are cultivating equanimity, what are you doing? You recognize the futility, right? The non-usefulness of reactions, of action in a setting, right? There are occasions when there's really not much or not anything you can do about the situation. Like, for example, if you're meditating in ancient India and there's too much heat, there's too much cold, there's really not much you can do about turning on air conditioning. Maybe you don't have the option of putting on your extra layer of robe and so forth. Right? All that you could do is to abide in equanimity, to allow unnecessary reaction to subside, right? To conserve your energy, to endure in peace, right? To abide in chanti, so to speak. So that's more about equanimity. All right, so coming back to what we were talking about regarding happiness and pleasure. So in a lot of Buddhist as well as Buddhist inspired traditions, there is this um, almost hostile, at least almost hostile attitude, or at least reservations about the roles of happiness and pleasure in meditation. But when we read the early Buddha suttas, right, it is clear that the Buddha had a very different attitude towards happiness and pleasure. But to begin with, we have these two uh, steps in the feeling-based satipatthana, and they are about developing your sensitivity towards happiness and pleasure, right? So the Buddha's advice wasn't just for you to kind of ignore them and to leave them be and just be observant of them, but rather the Buddha is asking you to kind of like train your inner muscle, so to speak, so that happiness and pleasure can, say, for example, become a more enveloping experience, can be capitalized by you for the sake of getting you into a mindset where you're ready to let go even more. Okay, to feed your mind better so that your mind doesn't have to resort to junk food, so to speak, out of desperation. And in fact, there are a number of suttas where the Buddha said very explicitly with regards to the pleasure, happiness, accords with the Dhamma, in other words, the healthy kind, the right kind of happiness and pleasure. Don't be afraid of them, right? But learn to embrace them, learn to develop them, for the developing of which will lead to great benefit, right? So that's the essential message. Now, I want to say a little something more about why this is the case. Like if you look at the way the spiritual path unfolds in Buddhism, eventually you're going to be at a place where happiness and pleasure indeed get transcended. Right? Eventually, you will be at a place where you let go of even dependency on healthy kinds of happiness and pleasure. But then that's really a situation that cannot be forced. That's really a mental state that for most people you cannot arrive at suddenly, abruptly, without waiting for the mental conditions to mature, right? So it's not something you can force. Now, if you have ever find yourself in a position where you just try to force yourself to let go, right? Because you were told by Buddhist teachers that letting go is the kind of like the ultimate and final recipe for destroying suffering. And you just go, okay, you know what? I'm just going to let go of everything. Right? If you ever try that, you notice that either it backfires, right? The mind rebels, right? The mind continues to hold on to the things that it revels in tenaciously, right? And oftentimes it leads to inimical and unexpected consequences, right? It can backfire. It could lead to pathology. It can lead to the mind clinging to phenomena even more ferociously than before. Okay, so the way letting go happens in Buddhism is through an organic process. It would typically involve, for example, allowing your mind the opportunity to see clearly the nature of the phenomenon that it is clinging to, right? Number two, your mind is cultivated so it becomes robust. How do you do that? Well, one of the key things you do is by feeding it well with higher kinds of happiness and pleasure. And once it's well fed in that way, it will be able to look back at the relatively inferior types of happiness and pleasure with confidence, with determination, and saying something to the effect that, I can let go of these things. I don't need these things, right? These things are problematic. These things are stressful. These things don't really lead to my happiness. I'm tired of these things. I grow weary of these things, right? I have a much better substitute than these things, right? Analogy I like to give is, like, let's say you find yourself in a position of being a counselor, being a, psychotherapist, being a meditation teacher to young folks who oftentimes find themselves in relationship problems, right? So a guy comes to you crying, a gal comes to you crying, oh, my girlfriend just left me, my boyfriend just left me. And then you kind of just offer the person a blanket advice about, let him go, let her go. She's not good enough for you. He's not good enough for you, right? And here, this person is feeling destitute and deprived and deeply unhappy. And then your advice is for him or her to just let it go, right? She's not good enough for you. But there's a part of her mind, there's a part of his mind that goes, no, 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 no. She's way too good for me, right? He's way too good for me. That's why he left me, not the other way around, right? And even if this person forces herself to let go, right? Yeah, quickly he will find himself, like maybe in sour grape when he says, "Oh, she's not good enough for me." He he didn't really mean it when he says so, right? He says so because he had no choice. He says so because he's desperate. So in Buddhism, in Buddhist training, the way you help your mind to rise above happiness and pleasure are like that. The mind has to be robust enough to be in a position where it does not feel deprived, where it does not feel hungry, where it does not feel an overwhelming sense of having to depend on these inferior forms of happiness. In order to be able to say, I'm ready to let these go. So this is how happiness and pleasure works in Buddhism. If you look at the hierarchy of the traditional jhanas, first jhana, second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana, right? You move from um, secluding yourself from worldly pleasures, right? And substituting it with otherworldly or jhanic or meditative happiness and pleasure, right? And then, once you're um, comfortable in that new place, you're then in a position to examine what is this new kind of happiness and pleasure that you're feeding on, and the way you are feeding on them, the way your mind enjoy them, the way your mind forms connections with them, and so forth. And once you're able to do that, your mind becomes even more sensitive, and it will be able to see, for example, that, happiness is relatively coarse. Okay, I just need pleasure to be satisfied, to feel well fed. And so the mind weans off its dependency on happiness and subsists almost entirely on pleasure. Right? And then it repeats the process. Once it becomes comfortable in this new place, being well fed by pleasure, right? It is in a position to examine the nature of this pleasure. It is able to examine how the mind is feeding on the pleasure, interacting with the pleasure, forming connections with the pleasure, and so forth. And then the mind becomes even more mature and weans off its dependency on pleasure. Then what? Then where does the mind perch upon? The sutta tells us that at fourth jhana, the mind perches on equanimity, right? Now, equanimity, contentment, peace, and so forth are enough for the mind. So the mind has no nostalgia for, has no hunger for even pleasure, right? And then you do one step further up to the supramundane. How do you go from fourth jhana to nibbana? Well, this is at least one way to describe it. Right? Even with regards to equanimity, you wean off your dependency, you wean off your hunger. for the experience of equanimity and peace. And when you're not addicted to even peace, when you're not dependent on even peace, when you're not even feeding on peace, what happens? You experience unconditioned peace, right? Which involves no mental fabrication, which is dependent on no condition, right? And that's nibbana. So this is the way spiritual path typically unfolds. When you look at it from the angle of the feeling-based satipatthana. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. And the other thing I wanted to say is how the Buddha asserted that happiness and pleasures are not created equally. They come in different qualities. So let me quickly share with you this little thing. Okay, this is something I dug up from the internet and I just find this helpful. All right. So, by the way, so what I'm going to explain uh, is really a greatly pared down, a greatly simplified explanation of the roles of dopamine and serotonin in human experience of happiness and pleasure. Okay, so uh, the more you study neurology, the more you understand how complex these things are, right? So they, your happiness and pleasure really cannot simply be reduced into, oh, one kind that is induced by dopamine and then another kind that is induced by serotonin. But then for our purpose today, okay, in order to get my point across very effectively, very simply, I'm going to subscribe to that pared down version, right? So we're just going to provisionally um, differentiate happiness into two kinds. There's a kind that is primarily associated with dopamine. There's another kind that's primarily associated with serotonin. So, what is the dopamine pleasure like? Well, it's typically brought on by, say, for example, you're enjoying a piece of chocolate cake, right? Or, someone paid a compliment to your good looks, right? You get a kick out of it, you are able to become intoxicated in your body image for a short while, right? Dopamine is typically brought on when, um, like um, you are uh, feverishly pursuing a romantic relationship, right? You feel this intense love and passion and so forth. That's dopamine related. Now, on the other hand, serotonin, at least the kind of pleasure, happiness primarily associated with serotonin, they have to do with more like long-term well-being. For example, the fact that you're content with where you are, what you have, um, the happiness you get from being in a mutually trusting, well-established relationship, right? You and your partner are, mutually trusting of each other. You admire many good qualities in each other. And this is a kind of well-being that is typically not as intense as, say, romantic fervor, but it is more conducive to a sense of stability, to a sense of security, to a sense of contentment, gratitude, and so forth. So there are these two kinds. And what more can we say about these two kinds of pleasure? Well, the dopamine type is fleeting, right? It quickly fades away. It may be more intense while it lasts, but it is very hard to sustain. So how long of a duration of happiness can a piece of chocolate cake bring you? Maybe 8 minutes, right? It's very, very hard for good food to bring you happiness that lasts longer than 20 minutes, right? If you really hungrily gorge down delicious food by the mark, 20 minute, 18 minute, and so forth, you're already somewhat satiated. right? So the more food you put into your mouth, they bring on diminishing return of pleasure. Eventually, it gets to a point where eating more not only will not bring additional pleasure, but it actually creates suffering. You actually feel revolted. You actually feel disgusted by the idea of eating more, right? So that's the nature of dopamine. Another thing we can say about dopamine is that it is addiction forming, right? And there are a lot of psychological theories that people offered on why uh, it is addictive in nature. One theory goes that when dopamine is released, and when uh, the neurons are exposed in a soup of dopamine, so to speak, uh, they become inured. The dendrites, the receiving ends of neurons, they become numbed. They are destroyed. They're burned off in a metaphorical sense by this plethora of dopamine. And the end result is that um, consequent instances of pleasure will bring on less and less pleasure. And you will need higher and higher dosage of pleasure to arrive at the same level of satisfaction than before, right? This is what a lot of drug addicts report, right? The first, a second time of using class A drugs is the most thrilling, most ecstatic experience. And all subsequent uses is your desperate attempt at mimicking, at duplicating, at revisiting that exceeding high initially, right? And this will lead to a sort of spiraling behavior, and it constitutes the key mechanism behind addiction. Now, serotonin, on the other hand, it doesn't matter how much you experience, say, for example, gratifying satisfaction or contentment or gratitude or sense of well-being, and so on and so forth. They simply do not lead to addiction. And this is very similar to the Buddha's own assessment. Right? What can we say about the happiness and pleasure associated with meditation, associated with jhana? Number one, they are brought on by letting go. They're brought on by dispassion. They're brought on by your unloading burden from your body and mind. Right? So, can you become addicted? Can you become attached to this process of weakening attachment? No, you cannot. Right? It's a paradox. Right? Meditative happiness is a result of detachment. So to say that, oh, okay, then the happiness that comes about by the detachment can eventually become attached, it doesn't really make sense. Okay. In fact, the deep sense of satisfaction, deep sense of peace that comes about by experiencing peace and letting go, detachment, dispassion, and so forth, they render your mind more capable of further letting go. Your mind will be able to see clearly that letting go does not lead to privation. This is very important. If you have not experienced this higher kind of meditative happiness slash pleasure, your mind automatically associates the absence of happiness as privation or letting go as privation, meaning that you are deprived of something, right? When you let go of money, that means you become poorer, right? When you donate away money, you donate $5 away, you are $5 poorer, right? It's a zero sum game. And your mind has this implicit conviction about the nature of letting go. It is afraid to let go. When you're a baby, when you let go, what happens? You drop from your mother, you fall to the floor, right? So it's very scary to let go. And yet, by experiencing the pleasure, happiness of letting go, of detachment repeatedly, extensively, pervasively, your mind becomes convinced that letting go leads to greater peace. Letting go leads to greater satisfaction. And this takes time. This takes, some time for the mind to rewire itself, to decondition itself from the former conditioning so that it becomes clear to the mind. And this is why a mind that has been steeped in meditative happiness and pleasure inclines towards equanimity, inclines towards peace, as opposed to becoming very insecure, becoming addicted to, becoming very dependent upon happiness and pleasure. Okay. So I hope this part is clear to everyone. Any question or comments? Why happiness and pleasure are employed in feeling-based satipatthana, why they're vital, right? Why is it the case that, hey, the fourth jhana is the highest? It's all about equanimity. So why don't we just bypass the training in happiness and pleasure and just go directly to equanimity? You won't end up experiencing, the chances are you won't end up experiencing authentic equanimity. You're experiencing, a sort of feigned equanimity, right? Or hollow or superficial type of equanimity. Okay, in the same way, in the Buddhist tradition, the Buddha doesn't just teach you to let go of your personality, to let go of your ego construct, right? To let go of all um, perching abodes for the mind, right? To let go of every kind of abiding. Right? If you do that, it'll just make the mind becoming disoriented, lost, feeling deprived, hungry, and even making it sick, rebellious, and so on and so forth. Okay. Alrighty. And let me move on to the final part of the feeling-based satipatthana. So we cover number 5 and 6, right? We kind of explained the roles of um, rapture and pleasure. Now, what about 7 and 8? Developing sensitivity towards mental sankharas and calming, tranquilizing, pacifying mental sankharas. Anyone remembers what is sankhara? Can someone can someone give us a brief overview or an
Isn't it
example?
just fabrications of the mind? Like the things that we make up, the things that we yearn for, or like create in our head.
Good, good. That would be a good example. Exactly, right? Was that Sarah, by the way? I didn't
Oh
see.
yeah.
Okay, good, good. That's very good. So as we explained before, sankharas are basically any sort of exertion of the mind, right? And in Buddhist psychology, this typically takes a form of the mind picking up something, the mind, pulling something in, welcoming something, yearning for something, becoming dependent on something, trying to become something, or trying to fuse or unite with the phenomena, trying to identify with the phenomena and goes, that's me, that's mine, right? The mind trying to push something away, right? Reacting, resisting certain phenomena. These are all examples of sankharas. Okay. Now in the past, when we talked about body sankharas, right? What are they? Well, number one, they're about physical exertions, right? When your body tenses up, when you carry patterns of tension in the body, right? Like a lot of people with trauma would do habitually, or oftentimes unawareingly, right? That would be a body sankhara. Another example of body sankhara would be you're identifying with the body, right? You're clinging to the body in a certain way. You go, oh, this is me. This is mine. This is about my image. This is where I live, right? When people ask you, where are you, right? But, in meaning that where is your soul, right? You're likely to point to your skull and go, I'm right here, right? I'm behind the eyes. I live inside the skull, right? To some people, maybe, she will point to her heart region. This is where I am, right? This is where my heart, soul resides, right? This is the very core of my being, my personality, and so forth, right? When you do that, when you form this connection with the body, that's also a body sankhara, right? So without understanding what is mental sankhara, can someone give me some examples? What is mental sankhara? Okay, Sarah gave us an example, right? The example she gave wasn't just about sankharas in general, it was actually about mental sankhara, right? But anyone else? What would be another example of mental sankhara?
This tastes good, that tastes bad, I don't like this, that person's annoying, yada, yada, yada.
There you go. So the sort of comments that we make, or commentary we formulate, our judgments we impart, right? Positions that we commit ourselves to, right? So the forming of the position, that's a sankhara. And then you're committing yourself to, right? You're doubling down on the position. That would be another sankhara, right? And then also, by the same token of the way we explain about body sankhara, when you cling to the mental content and go, I am my thoughts, I am the soul, that's also a mental sankhara. In other words, the identification you form with regards to anything mental in nature. Does that make sense? That this relationship you form with anything that's mental in nature, like a memory, right? When a memory arises, what are you experiencing? You're experiencing perhaps a feeling, perhaps a mental image, perhaps some thoughts. But then you don't just experience these things, do you? When you recall something, when you remember something, you also embed a sense of self into it. You go, that's my memory. That's my past. I live there, right? And this past means something to me. And then you react to this memory. Maybe you're like overwhelmed by grief, you're overwhelmed by nostalgia, maybe overwhelmed by pride, what have you, right? So those are all examples of mental sankharas. And just as is the case with the body-based satipatthana, the feeling-based satipatthana is a self-sufficient system, meaning that if either by your own choosing or out of necessity, you want to ignore the rest of the 16 steps and just focus on these four, right? Steps number 5, 6, 7, 8. Theoretically, these four can take you all the way to the end of the path, can take you to the highest Buddhist religious goal, which is the ending of all suffering. That's possible, right? So it is understood as a self-sufficient system, right? It is not, like, it's not the case that all these four groups, they're somehow sequential to each other. The bodily based satipatthana is the lowest, it's the easiest, it's the entry point somehow. And the Dhamma based satipatthana is the highest, as the most profound, and is to be practiced at the very end of your spiritual journey after you've mastered, you've completed all the previous 12, right? It doesn't work that way. For some people, the last group of four is the easiest for them, and they may start there, right? Or they may just limit their entire practice to this one group. And the same can be said about every other one of the four tetrads. Now, what is this mental sankhara that we're talking about? What are they doing in the feeling-based satipatthana? That's my next question. Previously, we explained how mental sankharas can include a whole host of different activities, right? So, um, um, Albert suggested making mental commentary. That would be an example, right? Uh, Sarah talked about, like mentally creating something. That would be another example. However, in the context of feeling-based satipatthana, mental sankharas have a very narrow um, meaning, has a very narrow definition. They are very specifically activities geared towards happiness and pleasure. Okay? Once again, we're not talking about mental sankharas in general. Right? Thinking about the future, right? Reminiscing about the past, um, identifying with, this sense of a body image. We're not talking about any of that. We're very specifically talking about activities directed towards happiness and pleasure. Well, what kinds of activities are created, are fabricated, are done, are perpetrated towards happiness and pleasure? One way to understand this is to think of happiness and pleasure as being manufactured and consumed. Okay? So, with regards to experiences of happiness and pleasure, our mind can do what? Our mind is actively creating them, and our mind is also actively trying to enjoy them. So, there are these two primary capacities. So, let me give you some examples of how the mind manufactures happiness and pleasure. Okay. Now, right now, you are giving rise to a thought. When I grow old, I'm going to be rich. I'm going to be successful. I'm going to have a nice mansion by the coast. I'll be surrounded by loved ones, so on and so forth. And in having created this fantasy, you experience some measure of happiness. Right. And we could tell why, because you were smiling right now and you were kind of like your attention is somewhere else. So I could tell that you were thinking about your retirement life, right? No, I'm teasing. So that's how the mind is manufacturing happiness. The mind can also be in a position of a consumer, right? Can play the role of a consumer with regards to happiness and pleasure. So with regards to this fantasy that you have just created, you are like, oh, yeah. The way you immerse in it, the way you proliferate this fantasy, right? So that's how you may be enjoying the pleasure. We enjoy pleasure using different ways. We interface with pleasures and happiness very differently. A more relatable analogy is once again having something to do with jacuzzi. All right, you could dip your toe into jacuzzi in a cold weather. Ooh, that's nice. Right, this is one way to enjoy jacuzzi. But then someone will come along and tell you, hey, there's a better way to enjoy the jacuzzi. Why don't you soak your legs into jacuzzi? And you do so, and you go, ooh, that feels even better than just soaking my toe into the jacuzzi, right? Now, what about if I were to go deeper, right? To um, allow my whole body, right, my torso to become immersed in a jacuzzi. Wow, this is so nice, right? So in other words, with regards to a happy experience, with regards to a pleasurable experience, you can experience it partially, you can experience it pervasively, right? You can experience a pleasure in a more awareing way, or you could experience a pleasure in a less awareing way. And typically when you experience a pleasure in more awareing, in a more cognizant, in a more clear-minded way, right? You form a different relationship with that experience. An example would be, I don't know, like drinking tea. Okay. So most little kids, when offer the options of drinking tea versus drinking, I don't know, your popular beverage like Coca-Cola, right? The kids would go for Coca-Cola, right? It's sweet, right? It's full of flavor, it gives you a kick, right? And of course, it's a no-brainer, right? Now, however, for people who have steeped in the culture of tea drinking, they know how to calm their mind, right? They know not to just gulp down the tea. They know how to savor the fragrance. They know how to, like fully immerse themselves in the overall atmosphere as opposed to just, aiming for the sharpest, the most intense type of sensory stimulation. And if you allow yourself to become exposed to that kind of experience, right, repeatedly, you have an acquired taste for tea. Chances are you'll find tea drinking to be much more gratifying and much more conducive to pervasive type of pleasure than, say, drinking, soft drink. So in the same way too, in the Buddhist training, when you experience happiness, when you experience pleasure, the Buddha frequently would ask you to examine the way you connect with these experiences. How exactly does the Buddha do that? Well, there is a sutta, Anguttara Nikaya 5.200. When you first experience first jhana, what do? What does the Buddha tell you to do? You don't just go, oh, okay, first jhana is not high enough. Let me bypass it. Let me let it go. Let me move on to second jhana. If you do that, you're not allowing your mind to become familiar with something new. Then the chances of your being able to repeat this experience in the future are very low. Okay, so to you, this special experience is just something accidental. It's something fleeting. You just stumble across a very special type of experience. And then because of your failure to give significance and to do something proper to form a more robust connection with this experience, chances are after this experience fades away, it's just going to become like a vague memory. You will not be able to revisit it. It will not become your normal state. So how do you turn first jhana, or in fact, any kind of good experience, any kind of healthy experience, healthy pleasure, happiness, to be kind of your norm so that you are able to, say, frequently invoke the experience? You'd be able to frequently uh, abide in that experience in a very stable fashion. You need to do something about it. And the sutta says you need to, number one, recognize the experience, appreciate the experience, right? Develop confidence in the experience, stabilize yourself in the experience. Then, you have a chance to make it your regular playground, so to speak. Then you're in a position to eventually rise above first jhana, move into the higher jhanas. This is how meditation proceeds. So, what do you mean by recognizing experience? You have to be able to see that this is something special. You have to be able to go, wow, hey, this is something, right? If you're just kind of like half blind, half oblivious, something happened to you, oh, I don't know, whatever is happening, right? You don't fully recognize the significance of something you're experiencing it, then your mind has no opportunity to form any kind of meaningful association with it, right? So you need to recognize it. And then number two, when we say familiarize, right, and appreciate and so forth, you're allowing your mind to have the chance to go into it again and again and again. Instead of going, oh, I'm afraid of happiness. If I experience happiness, I'm going to become addicted, right? I'm going to become attached to happiness. If you do that, you don't have a chance to become familiarized with the experience. You have to go into it again and again with the deliberate intention of, let me make this experience very dear to me, very familiar to me. And then you appreciate it, you contrast it with the other experience. So to give you an example, let's say I'm experiencing first jhana and I compare it to what was happening before first jhana. What was the mind doing prior to this? The mind was agitated. Yes, maybe the mind was experiencing sensory pleasures, but those pleasures are so fleeting. They're so ungratifying. They're so unsatisfactory. Right? They involve so much competition. They're dependent on so many conditions. I needed to work so hard for that pleasure. Right? You could examine the present pleasure against the backdrop of something else that you experienced previously. And then their contrast became clear to you. And this is how you deepen your appreciation for what you have here. This is how you develop confidence for what you have here. And you will be able to say to yourself, wow, this is way better. Contentment is way better than hungrily lusting after some pleasure, right? You will be able to see that, hey, like with the mind stabling, settling into this seemingly subtle type of pleasure, right? It is better than the mind being so busy and reacting to and latching onto pleasure, right? You'll be able to see that. You see that, hey, this is better. This is good. You have a time to settle down and drink the tea and appreciate the fragrance, right? Appreciate the atmosphere, the ambiance, the whole being. And you'll see that, hey, actually, tea drinking may, for me, be a more deeply enjoying uh, experience than um, getting sugary drinks. Okay. And once you've done that, right, you, all these things are sankharas, are mental sankharas, and geared towards happiness and pleasure. I hope this is clear to you. Okay. Alrighty. Any questions? Any thoughts before we take our first short break?
Hi, Professor.
Yes, please, Venerable.
I have a very quick question about just identifying our feelings. Yes, because just as I know, when we practice with our feelings, something like unhappiness, for example, and just or suffering, we just accept them or let them go. That can be the good way for us to practice. And but here, when you haven't just told us about the just go back again and into the deeply and enjoy the feelings. So something like different from my like something.
Okay, so first we're going to have to learn some skills about manufacturing happiness and pleasure,
Yeah.
right? First, we're going to have to learn the skill of putting aside very gross types of suffering, very gross types of stress, right? And so that you're working with a relatively manageable mental situation. You see, so it's not the case that, oh, you want to meditate while you're experiencing great happiness, unhappiness, right? And you just kind of like allow the unhappiness to simmer. That's not typically how meditation unfolds. So the Buddha's general advice is for us to, at the get-go, put aside the coarsest types of suffering, worrying, hankering in relation to the world, right? Now, if you happen to find yourself in a place in life where you have a lot of worry, where you have a lot of heartache, where you're suffering depression, then you need maybe some antidotal measures against them first before you can afford the luxury of using the more refined, subtler techniques on working the mind. If you're experiencing, gross depression, gross sadness, someone dear to you just passed away, the Buddha's advice will not be, oh, appreciate the happiness you have at the moment, right? Subtly tune into the pleasure tone in the body. That would be very impractical, advise, right? The Buddha would, generally say something like, well, first work on the courses, the most protruding um, hindrances, right? And once these things become manageable, once these things go into latency, once these things fall into kind of background, right? They're not actively bothering you too much, then you'll be able to use the surgical scalpels on the mind as opposed to having to always resort to like a big hammer, like a chainsaw to work with a mental thicket, so to speak. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Alrighty. So we are going to come back in 10 minutes. Okay. So we'll be back at 10:10. Do our this session. The first is the difference between happiness and pleasure. Okay, so piti and sukha, they constitute different ideas, different experiences in Buddhism. Instead of giving you some overarching definitions for them, it's easier to simply um, illustrate their meanings by analogy. Let's say that I just won the lottery. I just discovered I won the lottery. Right, the last time I checked, all the numbers matched, and I'm ecstatic. And I haven't really had a chance to enjoy the money yet. So I haven't had a chance to purchase anything with the money, to use the money, towards the end of buying me comfort, like creating any sort of nice, pleasurable experiences. But I am already looking forward to those comfortable, nice, pleasurable experiences in the future. That's kind of like happiness. And is this a nice experience? Yes. It's a very good experience. I'm thinking all my money problems are solved. I'm going to call in work tomorrow and tell them I quit. Right? This is the last you'll ever see Professor Chu. So it's a nice experience. Now, is it a perfect experience? Is it without its flaw? No. This very night, I'll be tossing and turning in my bed. I'll be checking the ticket in my drawer for the 40th time, making sure that it's still there, that I did not accidentally flush it down the toilet, right? This wasn't just a dream. That's something that's actually happened. And the mind is going crazy about, all right, maybe I ought to buy this gift for this friend. He was nice to me in the past, but maybe not something too expensive. Okay, and then I'm going to not buy gifts for these other people because, they were bad to me this way, that way. And the mind is performing all this calculation, right? Busy and thinking about planning for the future and thinking about like who are likely going to be beneficiaries of my newfound generosity. Okay, so it's far from being a perfect experience. There's suffering, there's stress, there's agitation, there's restlessness. So happiness compared to pleasure, happiness is kind of like anticipation for something nice to come, right? It's mental. It's more stimulating, it's more exciting. But then it also means that it's accompanied by smaller measure of peace, smaller measure of equanimity. Okay. Now, pleasure on the other hand, sukha on the other hand, at least in the meditation context, refers to something that is more sustainable, something more lasting, something that is calmer. Okay, something that is more soothing and so forth. Now, most people, before they've experienced any semblance of mental quietude, they will prefer the more stimulating experience. Most people, given the option, would you like to find yourself in a passionate relationship or in a long, trusting, stable, but otherwise uneventful relationship. Most people will find the former to be happier, to be a more pleasurable type of experience. But if you're someone who regularly accesses inner peace, right? Your mind is, like frequently in a very gratified place. It's not so hungry, it's not so desperate. Then chances are it will find the latter situation to be more pleasurable than the former situation. So in Buddhism too, most people that will immediately go for happiness. This is the um, most obvious, better substitute for boredom, right? But then happiness is also understood in Buddhist psychology to be imbued with a lot of defects. It's more agitating. It's less sustainable. It's less conducive to peace, as we've explained. That's the difference between the two. The other thing I want to say about happiness, about this first factor, about piti, okay? In all the years I've taught meditation to hundreds of people, I found that probably the greatest impediment to people experiencing meditation happiness is their unrealistic expectation, is their presumption about what kind of happiness they're going to experience with meditation practice. So in religious settings, in Buddhist settings, you frequently will come across people telling you, wow, meditation will bring on ecstatic, mystical experiences that'll just completely blow your mind away, right? How good is it? It's better than eating 100 chocolate cakes in one sitting, right? It's better than this and that, right? If you think of the greatest climax in life, right? And somehow that will pale in comparison to meditative happiness. Now, I am not saying that that kind of ecstatic, overwhelming experience is not possible. I'm not saying that. That happens. Right? But it's important to keep in mind that happiness, just like pleasure, they happen on a spectrum. Right? So for some people, occasionally, they will come across happiness that is truly mind-shattering and ecstatic, and like the commentary just talked about how a person can be made so enraptured that he floats in the air, literally. So maybe not the floating in the air part, but everything else about rapture, that may potentially happen. But don't hold don't hold the assumption that this is the only kind of possible happiness, or this is the only type of piti that can make you happy. Okay. In Buddhism, whether or not you are made happy, whether or not you are made comfortable, is usually not a function of the amount of happiness or pleasure you ended up receiving. It's usually not a direct translation of the intensity of happiness and pleasure that you ended up receiving. In other words, happiness and pleasure are not, some objectively quantifiable experiences. The way they're experienced is always embodied. The way they are experienced is always that they're experienced in the context of the mind. You participate in that experience, and then there is a subjective element. There's this subjective layer to the experience. So it's not about some absolute amount of happiness you're trying to arrive at, that you're trying to achieve, but rather it has a lot to do with what kind of attitude you bring to the experience. So it's entirely possible that, what appears to other people to be a small amount of happiness renders you deeply happy. right? The very small amount of pleasure ended up making you feeling very, like comfortable and so forth. Okay. The commentarial traditions in Buddhism, once again, the commentarial traditions are the traditions inspired by the commentaries as opposed to the suttas. They oftentimes talked about piti, talks about happiness in hyperbolic ways. They talk about, happiness that are so great, like you bliss out of your mind. There's a teacher, and I will quote him, you will go into this frozen ball of ecstasy, right? Now, if that's what you expect, and you think that, oh, happiness can only take this form, and every time your goal is to control, manipulate the mind, control, manipulate the breath, so to bring on that kind of result, you're going to end up feeling very frustrated. You're very disappointed, right? You're going to end up becoming even less happy than before you started meditating, right? So, what exactly is this happiness that people talk about in meditation context? What 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 makes happiness meditation type of happiness? Well, there are actually many different kinds we could talk about, but let me just focus on arguably the most important kind. Okay. And this kind, I'm going to start out by questioning the choice of word of happiness to render piti. Okay. So when we think of happiness, we think about how, oh, you go, "Ooh," right? There's a lot of mental bling bling. There's a big smile on your face. But with regards to piti, another English word comes to mind, and that is feeling inspired. What do I mean by that? The suttas tell us that a lot of people experience meditation happiness as a result of teaching the Dharma, listening to the Dharma, contemplating the Dharma. Okay? And what would that do to you? You will get a strong sense of direction. You'll get a strong sense of purpose. You will get a very clear idea on how to abide the mind. You will feel like you're infused with a sense of meaning, right? Wholesome and noble meaning in life. And that's very, how shall I put it, anchoring. It offers like a good anchor. It stabilizes the mind. So it's not arbitrary, nilly-willy type of happiness, right? But it's a grounded type of happiness. And you could call that spiritual inspiration. That's one kind of happiness. Now, if you, upon hearing this, you go, oh, that's it? That's what Buddhists mean by happiness. If you do that, if you're expressing, say, disappointment or discontentment, recognize that as a mental sankhara. Recognize that as a mental sankhara. That is actually a kind of hindrance. There are all these little things that we do that sabotage inner satisfaction, including our tendency to complain, including our tendency to be discontent. Right? On the other hand, if you try to be patient about it, right? If you already have the proper mental requisites, you will find that being spiritually inspired to be a deeply fulfilling thing. Now, earlier I talked about being in possession of these mental requisites. What do I mean by that? Most people, they will come to a meditation class like this, and they will expect to be taught some special meditation technique, right? So this is a technique I will use, I will repeat, and it will somehow magically produce happiness. But this is the problem with teaching meditation in a class setting such as this, as opposed to in a live setting, right? The way the Buddha teaches happiness is holistic. It's multifaceted. It's organic. It's dynamic, right? It's not really, it doesn't really just boil down to one or a few techniques you use to produce happiness, but it's about the way you live your life. It's about the sort of person that you are. So there are really like 100 things we can say about training oneself in happiness. How do you make yourself a generally happier person? How do you do that? Well, the Buddhist advice includes the following. So, one, are you making the right choices in life, like refraining from really harmful actions to yourself and to other people, so that you're relatively free from remorse, that you feel relatively okay about yourself, that you're comfortable in your skin, that you're able to sleep at night, that your sleep quality is good, as opposed to because your mind has to deal with all this remorse, all this regret, all this self detesting, all this, just being rueful about the bad choices you made in life, the disruptive forces that you voluntarily invite into your life are sabotaging your inner peace and so forth. If you're doing that and you hope that somehow by watching the breath in a special way you're going to feel happy, you're probably being unrealistic, right? There's so many things you have to take care of in your life to be in a wholesome place for wholesome happiness to happen. Okay? The Buddha's advice would include things like whether or not you are already someone with the proper renunciation mindset to be able to access meditation happiness. What do I mean by renunciation mindset? What is renunciation? What is 出离心? Right? Renunciation is about whether you're already tired of mental defilements, whether you are already fed up with unnecessary suffering in life, and you yearn for freedom, you yearn for peace, and you are wary of unnecessary bondage, or you're wary of unnecessary burden. You're eager, you're willing, you're happy to let these things go. That means your mind is properly imbued with renunciation. And if you're such a person, right? By the way, if you're not, it's not necessarily something intrinsically wrong with it, right? But the meditative path may not resonate with you. It's simple as that, right? In Buddhism, there's no eternal condemnation. Oh, if you don't walk the Buddhist path, you're going to be eternally punished in hell. If you're not a Buddhist and you're a bad person, blah, blah, blah. No, right? So the Buddha Dharma is really, according to the Buddha, for those with little dust in their eyes. It's for the selected few, for people who are of a certain mental attitude, and they will find the Dharma very resonating. They are already in a place where they're easily amenable to the instructions. And if you're not, it's okay. There might be other things for you in life, right? In the Buddha's estimation, the highest kind of happiness is complete liberation. But if you don't believe in that, or that's not something that you desire, then power to you. May you succeed in your path, in your endeavors. Now, on the other hand, if you happen to be the kind of person who resonate with the Dharma, and you, upon hearing the Dharma, instead of finding yourself bored, you're enraptured, meaning you're inspired, right? It really clicks with you. It resonates with you. There's a part of you that goes, that's the kind of happiness I want. That's the kind of peace I want. Okay. And now that I am clear and clear about what is suffering, what is liberation, wow, what bliss, what clarity, right? And you feel like now your life, there is purpose in life. You feel like what you do has meaning. These are all factors comprising piti, or happiness. Okay. Any question about this? Any any question about this? When you compare this with worldly or non-meditation related happiness, right? What is the latter like? When people say that you're good looking and you're happy for 2 hours, right? And when you really think about it, you know, your happiness is built on other people's unhappiness, right? You're good looking, that means someone else is not so good looking, right? And you're good looking, it probably means that someone else is better looking than you. You're also not completely happy, right? You're good looking and you're thinking, maybe in this lighting, maybe when I'm at this age, right? Maybe when I wear this clothes, when I wear this hairdo, right? And then, I'm not so good looking under a different condition, right? And you compare to that and you go, wow, like instead of feeding on such lousy type of happiness, let me abide in, say, for example, gratitude. Let me abide in kindness to myself, to other people. Let me abide in contentment. Let me savor simplicity. Let me be resolved in renunciation and dispassion. Right? And by the way, all these examples I just mentioned, right, examples of meditation and happiness, they're still not the highest pleasure, but they're better. They're better kinds of happiness than um, worldly happiness. And how they're better can only become very clear to you after you familiarize yourself in these pleasures, after you've developed confidence about these pleasures. Alrighty. Before we do a little practice, any questions? Any thoughts? Okay. So for the next practice session, yeah, feel free to either adopt. Yes, I see a hand. Xiaojing.
Professor, you mentioned that the steps, if we focus on the feeling, can you
I
hear
can
me?
hardly hear you. Yeah, I
Uh,
didn't catch what you're asking.
what about the voice now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. You mentioned that in the feeling, the 4 steps of feeling, the we are starting right now. The four
Okay.
steps, and
Okay. We haven't really had a
yeah,
chance to
yeah,
talk
I know.
about the fourth
Yeah, yeah,
one.
yeah.
Yeah.
I know. Yes, yes, yes. And
Uh-huh.
I mean that you mentioned that focus on these 4 steps can achieve the goal of the end of suffering.
That's right.
You mentioned
So
before
so
the
e- yes. Yes.
and
Yes, you're absolutely right. So the reason we know this is because there are these other suttas where only one or two of the tetrads were presented. And those suttas explain how those tetrads, or a single tetrad, could lead to the highest goal, could lead to arhathood, to lead to complete realization. You see. So the sutta that we're reading, the Anapanasati Sutta, is unique in that it kind of gives an comprehensive overview of many different kinds of satipatthanas. Yeah. So most of these satipatthanas there are independently, singularly featured in other suttas. It's only in a few suttas where all four are presented in a systematic and overview way, right? But otherwise, each one of the four tetrads should be understood as being self-sufficient in bringing about complete liberation, right? So body-based satipatthana is a system unto itself. Feeling base is a system unto itself. Mind base, it's a system. The Dharma base is a system. Yeah. And in the past, we explained how that is the case theoretically, right? For example, if you look at the body-based satipatthana, what are they? They're about being aware of the whole body and then tranquilizing bodily sankharas, right? Now, how would just these two steps bring about the complete cessation in suffering? Well, let's think about this in the following way. There are these two primary kinds of attachment, two primary kinds of mental defilements that Buddhists set out to eradicate, meditators set out to eradicate. The first one is called sensual craving, right? The complete eradication will lead to what is known as third fruition or the non-returnership, sangguo, right? And the second type of mental defilement is called the I am conceit. I am conceit, the asmimana, the eradication which will lead to the fourth fruition or arhahood, right? Alohango, right? So how would these two steps eradicate the first mental defilement, sensual craving? We kind of explain this by saying how the reason that the mind creates a sensory scenario like, oh, there's a faraway place with beautiful human being over there beckoning out to me, right? And then my mind goes, ooh, let me go there. Ooh, I feel invited. I can't wait to be there, right? And this is what happens when you enter into a dream, right? This is what happens when you enter into a daydream, right? And this is also what happens when a person dies with essential craving still in the mind. This desire to re-manifest in the scenario is what is behind rebirth, you see. But then by pacifying bodily sankhara, you are unraveling, you are tranquilizing the yearning behind. You're tranquilizing the tension behind this entrancing process. Does that make sense? You are, by ways of preserving ease in the body, undermining a foundation in sensual craving. And eventually your mind will clearly see that whenever it does this, whenever it yearns, whenever it looks forward to something, whenever it sticks out its head towards something, there's stress, there's suffering. Most people not see that. For most people, the suffering is masked. It's veiled by the strong anticipation, by the strong mental hunger. You see. But then because you are being aware of the body and then you're tranquilizing bodily sankhara, not only are you aware of the suffering, but then you are also deconditioning this tendency. So this is how the first tetrad will eradicate the first defilement. Making sense? So far, so good?
You
Yes
mean
or no?
that you mentioned
So far,
that
so good.
I still have the question. You mentioned that we are
I can
aware of
barely make out what you're saying. Yeah, it's your
uh
sound is coming across intermittently.
hmm, what about now?
It's better.
It's better. This
Mm,
earphone has something wrong, and the other earphone is completely doesn't work. I'm sorry.
mm.
Uh, yeah. You mentioned that the awareness of suffering, the awareness of suffering,
Awareness, acceptance, did you say?
the awareness of suffering, suffering, suffer,
Awareness is separate.
suffering, suffer.
Awareness suffers? Okay. So technically it's not that awareness suffers. Technically it's that awareness is aware of suffering. So the way this is set up in a lot of contemplative traditions is that um, awareness is not touched by any phenomenon. If you feel like, oh, I am being touched by phenomena, right? Y- y- You're really talking about the mind or consciousness or some other phenomena being touched by this phenomenon called suffering. But because of the fact that the mind is identifying with a phenomena, you take that to be yourself. Awareness itself doesn't get touched. Awareness doesn't, become dirty as a result of becoming aware of dirty phenomena. Awareness doesn't become holy as a result of, becoming aware of holy, phenomena and so forth. Awareness itself is unperturbed. It's like open space, right? If you think about open space, right? You go, um, could a pile of feces foul up empty space? Could it? And maybe you say yes, right? Like there's this lingering smell, this lingering stink that remains in the space. Well, actually, technically, it's not the empty space that gets fouled up by the stink. It's the air in the empty space that gets fouled up. Empty space cannot get fouled up. Does that make sense? Or no?
Oh, complicated for me.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't catch that.
It's a little complicated for me.
Oh, okay. Um, or you could think about the mirror analogy. All right, mirror, right? We know what a mirror is, right? So let's say that would the mirror be made, um, cheaper, or would its reflectivity suffer as a result of having reflected, say, a pile of dog feces for thousands of years? Would the fact that it's reflected a pile of dog feces for thousands of years affect or undermine or subtract from its reflectivity? Yes or no?
I don't know.
You don't know? So you think that by reflecting dog feces for thousands of years, the mirror would just lose its reflective nature?
No, no, no.
No, it would not, right? Of course
Yeah,
not,
no,
right?
yeah.
What about the opposite? What about if the mirror was reflecting, something really beautiful, like, I don't know, Snow White for thousands of years? That would that increase the or improve on the reflectivity of the mirror?
No.
No, right? So the reflectivity of the mirror is untouched by phenomena. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, yes.
So think about this other analogy. Okay, movie screen,
Yeah,
right? So let's say a movie screen's been playing, like films about murders thousands of times, right? There's a lot of
yeah.
blood that's featured in the movie. A lot of people got killed and so forth. Would the screen be somehow made less? Would its quality be affected by the sort of movie it plays? No.
No, no.
Neither would it by movies are about holy people, you see. Does that make sense? So the screen
Yes,
is not touched by the movie
yes.
that are being played. So in the same way, awareness is not touched by suffering. So yes, you are aware of suffering. And you may say that, oh, Shaojing is affected by suffering. But you are not Shaojing. Shaojing is just a phenomena reflected in awareness. There is this identification process where the mind goes, I am Shaojing, I am this body, I am this person. There is this phenomena, there is this process that's taking place in awareness, but awareness itself doesn't get affected. So if you think that you are suffering, well, actually, there is this phenomena called suffering, but then
Yeah.
awareness itself is not suffering. So the way liberation happens is that you cut off the identification. You no longer invest in, you no longer believe in that I am the phenomena. Rather, you clearly see and you completely settle into the fact that, in fact, you are awareness. You are this untouched space. You are this unconditioned freedom. Nothing can be said about you. What can you say about the mirror? Can you know, if I ask you, okay, fine, the mirror can reflect so many things, but what about the mirror itself? What is its color? Can you tell me? Is the mirror intrinsically red? Is it intrinsically yellow? Is it intrinsically blue? You cannot say anything about its natural reflectivity, right? Whatever you say about its color, you're talking about its reflection. You're not talking about its reflectivity. 它的本身的透明反射性是没有任何的颜色的, right? It's beyond all colors, it's beyond all forms, right? The same can be said about you. Same can be said about you. Everything you think you are. I am this body, I'm a girl, I'm a man, I am a American, I am a, you know, like whatever, right? Whatever you can say. It's a feeling reflected in a mirror. It's an image reflected in a mirror. It's a thought reflected in the mirror. What are you? Nothing can be said about you. If you're absolutely forced to say something about this nature, you go, freedom, not conditioned, wide open, all accepting, not perturbed by suffering. So what is nirvana? What is nibbana? The nibbana is when your mind's habit to identify with phenomena is completely quenched. So there's no longer any habit on the mind's part to form this connection with the phenomena. I go, that's me, I'm there, this is me. But you've mistaken an impermanent phenomenon to be yourself. This is why you suffer. This is why you believe you would die. This is why you believe you're sick. This is why you believe you're this finite being. This is why you believe, oh, I've done these bad things, I've done these good things. I'm this doer, I'm this enjoyer. And failing to recognize that none of these are really yourself. All of these are phenomena. What are phenomena? Phenomena are reflections on the mirror, are the movies played on the screen. Making sense now? And then,
Yes.
okay, and then coming back to what we said earlier about the two mental defilements being destroyed by the bodily base satipatthana. We already talked about the first one, or essential craving. There's a second one. The second one is called the I am conceit, 我慢, right? It's different from pride. The I am conceit. What is the I am conceit? The I am conceit is the mind's belief that it is a certain person, a certain phenomena, a certain attribute, a certain form, a certain body. So the mind takes on a phenomenon and go, this is who I am. This is what I am. This is where I am. That's called conceit. Okay. So I don't know if you recall the analogy that we gave. You're playing a computer game.
Yeah.
Okay. And in a computer game, you typically have an icon, you typically have an avatar in the computer world. So let's say you're playing a shooting game, right? And your avatar, your icon in the computer world is someone holding a gun, right? And yes, you are more or less simultaneously aware of everything that's happening on the whole screen, but you give special regard to this icon, to this image of a guy holding a gun. You go, that's me. That's me. Now, if you really like this game and you really identify with this character, then it would feel as if you become that person. You're living through that person vicariously. You're living through the icon vicariously. So when the monsters are trying to get you, right, and not only are you controlling the controlling stick, but you are also dodging like this, and you're sweating, and you're getting afraid, you're getting nervous, you're all tensed up, right? As if you were actually in the computer world, right? And but if you look closely at the computer world, what is that icon? What is the avatar? It's nothing but just an image. It's made of the same light dots as everything else in the computer world. You see, but then due to your habit of forming an emotional connection with the icon, you're treating it as yourself. You are tensing up around this pattern. You're tracing this pattern. You're giving special regard to this pattern all the time. You're tracing it all the time. You see? And this is what happens when there's conceit in the mind. You treat this universe, a portion of this universe, as holding a special significance, as representing the center, as being you, as being me. And then you're so invested in it, you've forgotten that there is this identification process, there is this entrancing process. You're becoming emotionally invested in this phenomena. You've taken this phenomena to be yourself. You see, when in fact it's not. The icon is not you, the avatar is not you. It's just that you form the link with the icon, right? Does that make sense? And then now think about it this way. So you're in the game, right? You're so absorbed in the game, you've forgotten your immediate environment. And your mother comes into your room and see that you're so deeply immersed in this shooting game. And she goes, come on, let's have dinner, right? And it's like all of a sudden you are awakened from this previous role playing, right? You're back to your normal self. You're back to your normal self, right? And you look at the screen, this is not as important as the reality, right? You could turn it off. You could disconnect this former link that you had with the avatar, okay? But then think about it this way. Now you think you're back to reality, reality? Is this the reality? Now, being a good meditator, you'll look at this and you go, huh, what about this thing called 小静? What is this phenomena? It's made of feeling. It's made of mental images. It's made of thoughts. It's made of the five aggregates. Is feeling me? No, feelings come and go. They're kind of like the avatar on the computer screen. They're made of dots. They're like disparate sensations. You could clearly see that this is a phenomena that you cognize, that you recognize, that you experience, that you feel. So you're not in the feeling. Feeling is something that you felt. So feeling is not self. Same with mental images. Same with thoughts. Same with intention. Same with every other aspect of the five aggregates. And when you completely decondition the mind's habit to identify with any phenomena, you experience profound peace, you experience suchness, the way things are, without your interacting with things. Yes, the body, yes, Xiaojing will continue to live. Xiaojing will do her thing, but then there is no investment, there is no tightening, there is no clinging to this phenomena, creating suffering. Right? This is why when you practice body-based satipatthana and you pacify bodily sankhara by unraveling, by seeing closely the sankharas you formed about the body, it can also lead to ultimate liberation. Does that make sense? Body sankhara includes the mental connections you form with the body. You go, I am this body, I'm this person, this is who I am. And you recognize what the mind is doing, right? And you pacify that, you let that go, you drop that, you tranquilize that. In your everyday life, right? Even whether you're in a formal meditation setting or you're in an informal meditation setting, in your everyday life, you try to be aware with great frequency the manner in which the mind identifies with the body. That's called body sankhara. It's one kind of body sankhara. And you drop that. You go, it's just a feeling. It's just a mental image. It's just a thought. And you don't reinforce, you don't perpetuate, you don't cement this connection. So you ended up deconditioning this process. So this is how you uproot the I am conceit. And with the I am conceit destroyed, a person attains arahanthood. Does that make sense now? Or
Yes, so do you mean that we know the body is not not earth, but before we know it, mm, we might act, um, we might respond to the body, but now we do not respond. We just let it be, so that we cut off the
Okay, I
connection.
don't want you to misunderstand step number 4 as being categorical reduction in activity. It doesn't mean that, right? So it doesn't mean that, oh, in order to practice step number 4, you lie flat completely. You stop doing things, right? Oh, because doing thing is a body sankhara. So the way to tranquilize that is to stop moving around and just lie flat. No, but rather you look at sankhara not as movement in general, but as what requires mental exertion. Those are two
But
different things. In other words, when the body experiences an urge to pee, you will need to stand up and, go to a restroom and relieve yourself, right? You have to do this thing, right? But in doing such a thing, people oftentimes mentally exert, looking forward to something. They couldn't wait to get somewhere. They're in a hurry. And their mind is identifying with the body, is embodying the body, is participating in the body, like it's picking up the body. And it's all these exertions are creating mental suffering, creating stress. It's not the movement itself.
yes,
The movement can come and go, can arise spontaneously, right?
yes,
You could really, like witness the living of Xiaojing, right? Xiaojing's life unfolding, right? So
yeah,
Xiaojing is doing her more or less normal things.
yeah,
But then there is no mental clinging to this phenomenon. There is no, you're, like believing in this role playing so obliviously as to have mistaken this phenomena to be you.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And by the
yeah.
way, these are really good questions. I'm happy that you are interested in exploring them. Why don't we defer some of these questions to the office hours, in
Okay,
which
okay,
we
okay.
could freely
Yeah, yeah,
talk more
yes,
about, both in Chinese and English, whatever modes you're more comfortable in. Yeah.
okay, okay.
But
Thank you.
these are really great questions. Yeah. I'm happy that your interest in this matter has been piqued. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else on people's mind? Alrighty. So once again, for the following practice session, feel free to adopt a more formal approach or, to adopt an informal approach. The formal approach, you may remember, involves your sitting up, right? Or stacking your spinal column carefully so as to engage in natural curvature. And you notice that by aligning your spinal disc in this way, alertness is heightened. And if you choose to practice in a more informal way, you could choose to meditate while standing up, while laying down, while reclining in a chair, in a sofa, in a very relaxed and a very casual manner. It is generally a good idea to start one's meditation by deliberately relaxing, by actively putting aside worries and hankering in relation to the world. So it is not the case that you have to cut off every single thought but you're actively putting aside worrying thoughts. You're actively putting aside thoughts that are engendered by mental hunger, wanting to be somewhere else, yearning for the future, being nostalgic for the past, and so forth. And if you have to think thoughts, try to think about feeling. So what is feeling? In any experience, whatever is happening, there is a pleasurable tone, there is an unpleasurable tone, or there is a neutral tone. There is a sensation or hedonic tone, hedonic hue to what is happening. Breathing in, being aware of feeling. Breathing out, being aware of feeling. And keep in mind that the concept of piti may not neatly translate into happiness. It can mean something like feeling grounded. Like you feel like you're anchored with a purpose. You're not listless. You're not directionless. But you are set out on the noblest of all goals, which is to train the mind so that it stops tormenting itself, so that it stops tormenting other people. This, according to the Buddha, is the noblest goal. And the fact that you're clear about this goal means that you're separate from the great majority of humanity already. Most people, really, with all due respect to them, live like zombies. They go wherever the karmic winds whimsically happen to take them to. They succumb to habits, to karma, blindly. And here we are, established clearly in our goal. That everything we do in life, we do not lose sight of this goal. This means that we're living a purpose-driven life. And we're increasingly clear about how the mind, through fever, through passion, through blindness, rises and turns and struggles in vain. And so you're not hungry for cheap pleasures. You don't just want to become temporarily intoxicated. You're happy to forsake that. You're not just looking for a temporary escape. You are cultivating clarity, sobriety, mindfulness, and clear comprehension, ardency. So that even though you may occasionally have to endure slight discomfort, overall you are protected by the Dharma. To be inspired by the Dharma means that the mind feels bright and light. And you don't have to describe this in hyperbolic terms. It just feels like you're grounded. It feels like you're leading a meaningful, fulfilling life. You're not just listless. You're not directionless. And with regards to happiness, you're not greedy about it. How happy do you want to be? However intense, however powerful happiness may be, it fades away. So you want something greater. You want maybe bliss. You want well-being. You want to feel healthy. You want to feel safe. You want to feel peace. So it's not cheap entertainment that you're looking for. It's mental health. It's well-being. It's inner peace that you're after. These things will render everything pleasant. On the other hand, if you lack mental health, if you lack inner peace, if you lack well-being, even if you go through happiest events in life, they feel superficial, they feel shallow, they feel hollow. They feel like they're barely scratching the surface. And you're still left deeply unsatisfied. And to live like a human being and being able to have heard such a message so that we're clear. And even though we may not be 100% clear, like a completely awakened person, but even being clear to this degree has already set us apart from the great majority of humanity. Now, how do we describe this mental state? Well, one way to describe it is contentment. You're not greedy for just happy experiences. You cherish inner peace. You cherish well-being. You cherish meaning. Now stay with contentment for longer. Your goal here is to recognize it, to appreciate it. Yes, in terms of intensity, it may not be as stimulating as some experiences in life, but it stabilizes. Here, you're able to find balance and contentment. Here, even if you have little, you feel rich. Here, though, it may not be perfectly quiet, but the mind is settling down. It's giving up on a lot of useless reactions, a lot of useless struggle, a lot of flailing and wailing. Here, maybe you're able to taste, even if for a little bit, the pleasure of simplicity in the here and now. I don't need much. I am content. The fact that the mind is gradually surrendering greediness, surrendering feverish pursuit, itself comfortable. We're usually so driven by hunger, by mental thirst. We're not leisurely enough to be able to see how settling down is comfortable. Giving up agitation is comfortable. Now, there's a part of your mind that may be complaining, but I can't even achieve that. I'm not really experiencing a lot of peace here. I'm not experiencing a lot of quietude here. But even with regards to whatever meager amount of peace, this gradual settling down, you're not greedy. You're not looking for something overwhelming. You're not looking for something unrealistic. Even in the face of this meager amount of peace, you are content, or at least you're training in contentment. Yes, maybe I am just making a baby step towards inner peace. But with regards to this baby step, I appreciate it. I recognize it. I savor it. I'm patient with the process. I will not let impatience disrupt, undermine happiness. What's it like in this moment to be living with purpose, to be living with clarity, to stay with contentment, to enjoy simplicity? What's it like? Don't be in a hurry to judge, to come up with elaborate commentary. Sit with it for a while. Learn to enjoy. Now, this is a different kind of enjoyment. Yes. We're used to busily interacting with a strong, engrossing stimulus and then calling that happiness. But look at this. A gradual, patient settling down of the mind, a tempering in greediness. Making oneself comfortable in what is simple, in what is already available. Fully recognizing that here, there's an absence of hankering. There's an absence of discontentment. Whatever it is that I'm experiencing right here, I am not impatient. Complaints do not arise from this mind. Instead, I appreciate seemingly little things like clear-headedness, sobriety. So even if there's no strong, powerful, overwhelming stimulus, there is this sobriety, clarity, and I savor it. And even though there's no diverse, blindingly diverse stimulation, there is this contentment, gratitude. As is the way the Buddha praises his more accomplished disciples. These disciples are easily supported, easily contented, not feeling a lack even in simplicity. Endowed with mindfulness, they do not lose sight of their purpose. Or would you rather be exposed to very stimulating sensory pleasures, but then feeling unhinged, feeling unsure, feeling insecure? Or would you rather have simplicity, but then feeling grounded, at ease, mentally healthy, and clear? Once again, you're not looking for, some perfect mental state. It may be the case that you're experiencing some distractions, some restlessness. You're not completely happy about the mental state that you're in. But keep in mind, we're training in contentment. Let me find enough here. Let me become more alert to the mind becoming agitating, possibly hankering for something else, to be somewhere else, to want more. Instead of treating this relative uneventfulness as a boring thing, you seize upon this opportunity to familiarize yourself with a state. Patiently acquiring taste for what is simple. Enjoying the kind of mind that is inspired, imbued with clarity, feeling balanced, not upset by agitation, restlessness. And we are bringing this practice session to an end. So please open your eyes if they were formerly closed, and turn the camera back on whenever you're ready. So this is a very simple exercise in quote unquote sensitizing oneself to happiness. Okay. Any questions, thoughts? Would anyone like to share his or her experience? So before we end the class today, I do want to share with you this one final piece about cultivating happiness. For a lot of people, their meditation practice proceeds from employing a lot of artificial methods and then moving towards what is increasingly more natural, what is more and more effortless, right? So in the beginning, if you want to resort to something very artificial, you could try that too. Like, what are some more artificial way of gladdening the mind, of cultivating happiness in the mind, of sensitizing the mind to happiness? For example, you can deliberately inculcate a sense of gratitude by holding a narrative in the mind. Okay, we can think our way into feeling grateful, so to speak, right? That can be done. So, for example, there are these little things that are circulated on the internet about understanding where we are, wealth status wise, in the world, right? You may not think yourself as particularly wealthy, as having a lot of material abundance and so forth. But once you put things into perspective, you may quickly realize that all of us really, occupy the very top of the pyramid in terms of the material comfort, in terms of material abundance that we have access to, right? Even when comparing to kings of a yonder age, the fact that, with a simple turning on of a button, we have access to hot water, we'd be able to take hot bath, right? This is something that even, like kings in the pre-modern times can hardly dream of, right? The fact that we're healthy, right? The fact that we have had the privilege of listening to the Dharma, retaining it, right? Holding a human vessel, being capable of spiritual progress, right? So there are all these different kinds of narratives you can hold to cultivate, to engender, to foster some sentiments you like to foster. It could be gratitude, it could be compassion, it could be kindness to yourself, it could be forgiveness towards something that you previously hold resentment towards. Is this part clear to everyone? Any question, comments? If not, I'm going to just do one more very short practice session to end the class. Okay? So once again, if you like, you can turn off your camera temporarily. You feel free to adopt the preferred mode of meditation. You could do meditation sitting up, standing up, uh, laying down, reclining into a chair, into a sofa. And holding a narrative in mind means holding a certain perception in mind. At least that's the way it's described in the suttas. Let my life be free from enemies. I hold no ill will towards any living creature. I happily, sympathetically delight in all the good causes on the part of living beings. Yes, there may be people I don't like, things that I hate seeing, but let my heart harbor no resentment. Instead, let there be forgiveness and understanding. So this practice doesn't require you to like everyone, but it demands that you forgive everyone. So if there are people whose sight, whose very idea of existence annoys you, brings you pain, causes heartache in you, think of these people as victims of their own illness, mental illness, mental defilements, maladaptive habits. practically all living beings mired in ignorance, right, in their desperate pursuit for happiness, harmed themselves and other people. But upon understanding this, even though likes and dislikes may remain, but let there be no resentment, let there be no enmity, let there be no hatred in my mind. What does the mind feel like when it is unburdened, when it is not loaded down with hatred, when it is not loaded down with resentment, with grudge, with complaints? Let the mind not be stuck on any image that your emotions are still unresolved about. The feelings that you're still unresolved about. You appreciate the fact that there is this freedom from ill will, freedom from hatred. It may feel like an uneventful thing, but it's actually a fact to be appreciated. At this moment, the mind is not burdened by hate. The mind is not burdened by unforgivingness. The mind is not taking up an antagonistic stance towards anyone, anywhere. And it's unlimited in that way. Yes, there are people you may choose not to associate with, right, to steer clear of. But this doesn't mean that you hold grudge about the person. A grudge is a burden that you put on yourself. Unforgivingness is a burden that you put on yourself. And let me unload this burden so that at this moment I harbor no fear towards anyone. I harbor no ill will towards anyone. I'm not asking you to actively like someone. Just enjoy the simplicity that comes from no hate. No grudge. No complaints. And before we end this practice session, you may choose to resolve in your mind, whether in walking, in standing, in sitting, in laying down. I shall look after my mind as if it's the only child of a loving mother, protecting it from hate, from ill will, from aversion, from complaints. So that everywhere I go, there is at least this enjoyment, freedom from hate. I'm not greedy for more. I can savor the simple fact that there is an absence of hate right here. And with that thought, feel free to open your eyes if they were previously closed. And whenever you're ready, you can turn the cameras back on. So in the Buddhist traditions, there are a lot of similar antidotal meditations, if you will. You're holding certain perceptions in mind, holding certain narratives in mind to bring about a mental state, a certain attitude, certain understanding. And this is typically used to bring about some initial state of ease, satisfaction, contentment, inspiration, right, or release from hindrances, and so on and so forth. And once there, you will be able to work on subtler aspect of the mind. For example, the subtle activities that are responsible for creating and holding together these perceptions in the first place, and then manage to tranquilize them. Right? The goal is to eventually incline the mind towards that which is increasingly effortless, that which is increasingly less fabricated, and so that our peace and ease comes much more naturally, as opposed to having to go through relatively complex visualization and self-talk. Okay, I hope this logic is clear to everyone. Any thoughts, questions before we end the class? Or if you'd like to share your experience with meditating. Okay, so if not, please be reminded to submit yet another weekly reflection on this practice, very specifically step number 5, right? Sensitizing the mind to happiness. Alrighty, so I will see you next time. Please take care. Bye-bye.
Will the videos be on Moodle?
Yes, once again, thanks to Xiaojing. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.